part of our series, Perspectives on 1916, we're joined today in the studio by Professor Richard Grayson, and we're talking about Belfast, Somme. And so when we're talking about the Somme, to begin, I think it's worth putting it into context. I would imagine when people do think of the Somme, they maybe think of the first day, that first major engagement. But the Somme offensive itself was, it was a dozen different battles over several months. Can we give some of the context of what this offensive actually was?
It goes on from the 1st of July until the 18th of November. Although there are even historians around now who will argue that actually the battle shouldn't be considered to have ended until February or March of the next year, because there were things going on afterwards. The 1st of July is the most well-known day. It's the worst day in the history of the British Army. It's particularly well known here because of the Ulster Division's involvement on that day. But you've got soldiers from Belfast involved at many different stages of the battle. Particularly in July and particularly in September, but at other stages too. And there are many Irish regiments involved on the 1st of July beyond the Ulster Division.
Can we talk then a bit about the Ulster Division itself, the 36th, and the way in which it was incorporated into the British military structures?
Well, the Ulster Division, in popular memory, is linked to the Ulster Volunteer Force. The narrative is of men joining the UVF in 1913 and serving in that in 13 and 14. And then at the outbreak of war, Sir Edward Carson, leader of the Unionists, talked to the War Office about what could be done with the UVF, because many of the men in it were very keen to join up to fight for King and Country. By early September 1914, he'd reached a deal with the War Office that the Ulster Volunteer Force could form a division of the British Army, a division numbering around 16,000 men, around 12,000 of whom were infantry. And in the early part of September, different UVF battalions join different battalions of the Ulster Division, and they then train close by, much of their training at Clandeboy, until May 1915, when they go to England for some further training, and then go over to France in October 1915. And their first major action, though, is not until 1st of July 1916. Now that's the popular story, but it is actually rather more complicated than that when you go into the detail.
Can we talk a bit about the experience of the 36th Division here?
Yes, it's a battlefield that is perhaps not fitting our popular image of a battlefield. It's not mud and destroyed trees. It's actually a very rural scenario. It would resemble a First World War battlefield later and quite soon after. But on the 1st of July, the men of the Ulster Division emerged from Thiepval Wood and try to take the Schwaben Redoubt. They do that successfully and hold it for a number of hours, but they are let down by the failure of troops, through no fault of their own, on either side of them to take their targets. So you find a situation where the Ulster Division's under fire from the Germans in the front of them, and also to either side where ground hasn't been taken. And by the evening they're retreating back into the wood. And overall, from the 16,000 or so men who were in the division on the 1st of July, you have around 5,500 casualties, of whom just over 2,000 are dead. And that really affects many parts of Ulster.
How was it then they were able to recover from that first battle? Because obviously we know that they had other engagements, they were involved in other battles as part of the Somme offensive. So how was it they able to get over that first day's losses and those casualties that they sustained?
If you take a unit like the 9th Royal Irish Rifles, recruited from the West Belfast UVF, they had around 800 men going into battle on that day. Just over 100 are killed, and several hundred more are wounded. But a lot of the wounded recover quite quickly. They may be days or weeks, perhaps months, but often quite quickly. And they then get supplemented by drafts, fresh soldiers from home, often men who joined up a bit later than the initial wave of UVF enlistments. That, of course, starts to affect the character of the unit. The Ulster Division is, after the Somme, being supplemented by reserves from across Ulster and sometimes from the south too. They're not UVF men, Very steadily, they have a lot of English and Scottish drafts sent in. By 1918, a lot of regular Irish soldiers have been drafted in, and what was a very Protestant division to start with had 3,000 Catholic soldiers in it by the end of the war, and a Jesuit chaplain in the 2nd Royal Irish Rifles. And this, of course, is not Carson's original Ulster division, but they're sustained by drafts from across the UK.
Well, I suppose it is worth mentioning, of course, that the Royal Belfast men who signed up, to the British Army hadn't not necessarily been involved in the UVF, but were there from the first days as well. I mean, you see Belfast men, not from the UVF, but who are in the British Army from the early days of the war.
It's important to remember 1914 and 1915, before the Somme. And at least on the Western Front, much of the fighting that takes place in 14 and 15 is by regular soldiers and reservists. Regulars would be those who joined up before the war. You find working class areas of Belfast, as working class areas do, producing lots of soldiers and sending lots of men away. The reservists are men who may have been soldiers, but essentially they're the equivalent of today's territorial army. And they were obliged to join the army on the outbreak of war. So they're called up. One of the interesting things about that is that lots of men who were members of the UVF or the Irish Volunteers were also reservists in the British Army. They were men who were interested in military type things. And you find that in units like the 2nd Royal Irish Rifles, which my own great uncle served in, you have men from both sides of the divide. Because in the regular units of the British Army, there's no sectarian division. Men just join up from wherever they're coming, and they're put into, in Belfast particularly, 1st or 2nd Royal Irish Rifles. So you get a lot of mixing at the front in 14-15.
And part of this, of course, when the 36th Ulster Division and the 16th Irish Division as well joined up, they're part of what's known as the New Army. Can we talk a bit about this and just how the British Army was forced to adapt to this new kind of warfare that was being seen in France?
The New Army really gets onto the Western Front in late 1915, early 1916. It goes into trenches with more experienced soldiers rotating around, learning how things are done. The 36th Ulster Division arrives in October 1915 in France. The 16th Irish Division, a couple of months later, they are actually in serious action before the 36th. They come under quite heavy German attack in April 1916, indeed during Easter week. So, and the 16th Irish Division is recruited from former Irish Volunteers, supporters of John Redmond, who thought that by joining the British Army they would make Home Rule more likely. So there's a really poignant comparison, I think, between what's going on in Dublin during Easter week and what's going on the Western Front, involving Irish nationalists of a slightly different hue to those involved in the Rising. In addition to those soldiers, those New Army soldiers on the Western Front, many Irish recruits in the New Army were at Gallipoli and landing in August 1915 as part of the 10th Irish Division, which is non-sectarian. That's not political in any way. It's predominantly Catholic, but it's very mixed, particularly units of the Royal Irish Rifles. And so I think this is a bit of a challenge to our popular idea of fresh recruits joining up, seeing action on the Somme, being killed. Actually, the volunteers of the New Army from here are first in action at Gallipoli in August 1915.
The 16th Irish Division itself, as you mentioned, saw action before the Somme itself, for example, the Battle of Lewes. I mean, what then was their experience? I mean, what kind of losses or what experiences were they having of this period?
They were having quite heavy attritional losses. When it gets to their involvement actually on the Somme in September 1916 at Guillemont and Ginchy on the 3rd and the 9th of September, over those two battles, they suffer around 4,000 casualties, of whom around 1,000 are dead. The casualties are getting towards those suffered by the Ulster Division, albeit over 2 days rather than one. And their losses, their fatalities, are around half those of the Ulster Division. But these are still sizable numbers when you think that there would be men there in the 6th Connaught Rangers, say, from very small nationalist communities in Short Strand and in the Falls.
Do you think the Belfast nationalist experience of the Somme would be as well known as, for example, the UVF experience?
It was very unknown until the 1980s, when Terry Denman, historian of Irish military history, produced a number of important publications, particularly a book called Ireland's Unknown Soldiers, and that sort of brought the story of the 16th Division out to, you know, an academic and very sort of widely read historical audience. But it wasn't really until the mid-2000s that the story of the 6th Connaught Rangers became well known through a group called the 6th Connaught Rangers Research Project, which draws from people from a very broad nationalist background. And they were the first nationalist group to talk about Irish nationalists as nationalists in the British Army, rather than as people who just happened to be there. You know, there were Willie Redmond was known about, Tom Kettle was known about, but Belfast nationalists in particular had been forgotten for obvious reasons during the Troubles. And over a decade now, they've done a lot of important work to resurrect that story.
So that's it. Imagine, you know, unlike the Schenkel, the story is probably more developed in popular memories. Is that something you find, that there is a very strong popular memory?
Well, certain parts of the story are very well developed, but there is a focus almost entirely on the 1st of July and on the Ulster Division. And you see this in some of the information that is put around, even on tourist information points. There's one in the Shankill that talks about 780 men joining up. Well, as far as I can tell, that's just in the 9th Royal Irish Rifles. When I wrote my book Belfast Boys, I actually found over 6,000 men from the Shankill who joined up, and another few thousand from the Falls, which was proportionally much smaller then than it is now, and they're enlisting in roughly equal proportions to their populations. So what's happened is there's a story been told of 1st July 1916 that has forgotten quite a lot of the rest of the story. Now, I'll defend that because it's the most dramatic moment of the war. You know, if you're a loyalist in the Shankill who wants to commemorate one moment of the war, obviously 1st of July makes sense. What it's important to do is to try and remember the rest of it. Research I've done on the West Belfast UVF shows of around 140 men I identified who enlisted. Very hard to know who was in the UVF or not. It's reported in papers or it's not in their army records. Of 140 men I identified, a third of them never served in the Ulster Division. One of them ended up serving in the 16th Irish Division, a man called Isaac Hughes. So these are complex stories. So one of the things I try to do is to persuade people to think about the much broader context.
You mentioned having a relative who fought then. I mean, for yourself, was that your window into this?
My dad was born and brought up in England, but both of his parents grew up in Lurgan. And my grandfather signed the Covenant in 1912, as did the rest of that side of the family. And so we had family photos from the First World War era around the house. My grandfather served in the Royal Flying Corps and then settled in England after the war. My grandmother's brother was a member of the 2nd Royal Irish Rifles and was killed in 1915. And it was really his story that got me interested in this. And I just started doing, I visited his grave when I was 18, which is going back to 1987 now. And then over the years, I just did a lot of genealogy into the family history. I trained as an academic, spent a lot of time working outside academia. When I came back in, I was seized with the idea of actually doing something about Belfast's First World War. So I sort of combined academic research qualifications and skills with the family interest, and it's been a really interesting journey.
How important do you think that element of local history is to these kinds of projects?
Well, I think it's essential. I call it military history from the street. There's a standard way of writing about places connected with units of the British Army across the UK. You take a unit that's linked to that area and you write about its connection with the area. Happens particularly with the PALS battalions in the north of England. If I'd done that for Belfast boys, I would have written just about the 9th Royal Irish Rifles in the Shankill. But at a very early stage, and in fact that was one of my original intentions, but at a very early stage I found that there were all sorts of interesting stories out there about West Belfast, about men who were not in the 9th Royal Irish Rifles. So I realised that actually what I needed to do was start not with a unit, but just start with the streets. So find everybody using all sorts of different sources from West Belfast, wherever that was, defined broadly as the Falls and the Shankill, and just tell a more complicated story. And you can only, that's how you get to knowing that a third of the men in the West Belfast UVF weren't in the Ulster Division, by doing that really painstaking research. That's how you throw up the fact that the geography was much more complicated. I mean, you wouldn't hear now the phrase Andersonstown UVF, but there was one, because the population was much more mixed at that time, and that all comes from military history from the street.
And going forward, I mean, I know your work has inspired others. For example, Jason Burke is doing similar work on East Belfast and so on. So do you see now, especially with the centenary of the Somme upon us, do you think that there is more of an opportunity now to delve into those complex histories and get away maybe from some of the myths that exist around the period?
Well, Jason's doing incredible work on East Belfast, and he's throwing up all sorts of complexities. And I think that's the only project on a large scale that's used those kinds of methods. I think some of the issues in East Belfast are different to West Belfast, some are very much the same. It's been interesting looking at the centenary, the extent to which I think there are two processes going on. One is a real thirst for new stories, new knowledge, an interest that people have in having their own preconceptions challenged. But there's also a very understandable desire to commemorate sacred aspects of community history. And those are sometimes the most simplistic bits, but they're also the things that are really deeply held and the things that divine people. And they rest on history as well. They rest on historical truths of one type or another. But that's been frustrating as a historian, because you hope to complicate the story and yet you see some of the simple things continuing. But they will. There's nothing you can do about that. You just hope that people embrace both sides of the debate, and often they do. Often they, many of the people involved in reenactments are also attending public lectures and thinking very deeply. So it's not it's not two groups of people, but it's two different types of activity which are going along in parallel.
It's interesting you mention that, because one of the themes it seems that you've looked at is this area of alternative history, where you're asking the question, what if the 16th Irish and the 36th Ulster Division had actually had reversed roles in the Somme? You're throwing up maybe some interesting scenarios there.
Yeah, the fact of the Ulster Division being on the Somme on the 1st of July and suffering as it did is so important to Unionist Loyalist memory here that I just wondered, what would have happened if they'd been in action in September, not July. Would that have made any difference? Because actually the September phase of the battle is much more successful. Losses are still quite high, but ground is taken and held. There's not a narrative of sort of martyrdom, if you like, of men advancing, taking ground and then having to retreat. What if that had been lost? What if that story had been lost to the loyalist mindset? And how would it have affected politics in Northern Ireland in later years, particularly with the foundation of the state and the sense in which sacrifice in the war was important to that. The conclusions I came to were actually that probably politics in Ireland would not have been very different during the war because of this. But if you move from July to September, you don't have the coincidence of the Battle of the Somme with the Battle of the Boyne anniversary, celebrated, commemorated as it was on the original date of the 1st of July. And I think that makes commemoration different if you don't have that coincidence. I think it makes it different in terms of how people articulate what Ulster men were doing on the Somme at the time. It also means, though, if the two divisions had swapped places on the Somme, they probably have swapped places earlier. And so the Ulster division would have been at Hulloch, facing the gas attack during Easter week 1916 while the rising's going on. So you suddenly have a different event that would be commemorated. And we already know, I have an Ulster Unionist Party general election leaflet from 1987 general election, which contrasts the loyalty of Ulstermen on the Somme with the Easter Rising. So that's 71 years later. But imagine if they'd actually been fighting at the same time. If the Rising had been going on while the Ulster Division had been going on, had been in action at Hulloch, the contrast between loyalty and rebellion would have been so much more marked. So I think that would have made commemorations now of Easter 1916 perhaps more fraught, even more fraught than people thought they might be, and probably turned out not to be. But I think you might also then have some kind of shift to 1917 for commemoration, because if you wanted to tell a story of futility and slaughter, then instead of the Somme, Passchendaele becomes that battle for the Ulster Division. So we might have quite different commemoration in 16 and 17 than we've actually turned out to have. And my sense is that 1917 will not be much marked. There will be some attention to the Battle of Messines, there will be some attention to Passchendaele, but it will not be 1916 in any sense.
The Somme, still in popular memory, is of massive casualties for very little gain. But do you think that's something that, when we get back to local memory, do you think that's something that figures in, or is it more a case of remembering the people and who did die?
I think if I were to try and pick one word that summed up what people who are remembering the Ulster Division on the 1st July 1916 are thinking about, it would be sacrifice. So, I think an element of that is a sense of a lost cause, a sense of, on the Schwaben Redoubt, the Ulster Division actually being in something like a state of siege. And of course that speaks to all sorts of aspects of Unionist, loyalist memory, self-understanding. And so I think people are remembering that. I'm not sure people are thinking much about the wider battle. Partly because it's just hard to find, beyond the occasional BBC documentary, simple ways of understanding that the battle went on for a long time and that there were successful phases to it. But even then, we can bandy about this word success and successful phases. Well, one of those is the 16th Irish Division at Guillemont and Ginchy. 1 in 4 of them casualties, and a quarter of those casualties dead. 1,000 men dead. That's what success looks like in the First War. It's still very high casualty and fatality lists.
Why do you think it is so important, speaking generally, in history of the First World War?
It's important in the First World War because many of the tactics and techniques that the Allies would eventually use in 1918 to win the war, to defeat Germany militarily, are learned on the Somme, or at least they begin to be learned. That doesn't mean that there's a steady learning curve right the way through the war. Otherwise, you wouldn't have the disaster that is Passchendaele. Things still go wrong. But it is the place in which things like the creeping barrage, with soldiers advancing very close to a barrage so that the Germans don't have time to get out of their trenches after the barrage ends, that begins. You know, the tank is deployed towards the end of the battle, not that successfully, but it's there. A lot is learnt about coalition warfare, decision making between the British and the French, but it would be a long war after the Somme.
Well, again, Richard, thank you very much for being with us today for this conversation.
Thank you very much, very good to be here.